Hello and welcome back to Degesch America Presents. I'm Ben Harrell, and as always, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to talk to all of you about the industry that I work in. On the last episode, we talked to Mike McLean about some of the duties that you have to perform during the aeration period, and he also filled us in on some of the pending label changes related to phosphine. Now, on this final episode of Season 4, we wanted to do something a little bit different and drill down into one particular type of fumigation that we haven't really covered on the podcast in much detail until today, and that's ship fumigations. So, we've invited Michael Carette-Meyers, Internal Technical Advisor for Degesch America, to join us to discuss some of the methods involved with fumigating vessels. So, please help me welcome Michael to the podcast. Okay, Michael, how you doing today?
Doing excellent. It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining. And as we say in Washington, the mountain is out.
I like that. So what I usually do at the beginning, and I know this is the first time you've been on the podcast, so I always give everybody kind of an opportunity to tell us a little bit about themselves.
Well, hello. I'm Michael Carette-Meyers. I am a lifelong fumigator and pest elimination guy. I've been in the business officially for 38 years, although I started doing this with my dad when I was about 4 years old and grew up taking care of rodents and carpenter ants and all kinds of stuff and started fumigating in 1985.
Okay, so you've been around a while. That's good news. You know, I'm definitely talking to the right person then, right? So I know that at least most recently, over the last several years, you've had quite a bit of experience with something, a corner of the fumigation market that I have almost no experience in at all, and that's ship fumigations. So I wanted to pick your brain today and kind of ask you about ship fumigations. Number one, because I don't know a whole lot about it. You know, being a Midwest boy, you know, if you ask me about grain bins, I can talk all the live long day about grain bin fumigations, but I don't live anywhere near coastlines, so I don't know a whole lot about ship fumigations. But I just want to kind of start out by asking you to just kind of walk us through what a typical ship fumigation looks like and maybe some of the steps involved.
Well, sure. And I find these kind of things absolutely fascinating because having spent a whole lifetime as well fumigating all kinds of different things, it is always really interesting to do something that not a lot of other people do. And it makes it very interesting and very, it keeps your job fresh and it helps you to get up in the morning and just really be passionate about what you do. But vessel fumigation is really, when you put $20 to $40 million worth of soybeans or wheat or any of these kinds of commodities into a big Panamax freighter or a 5-hole or a 7-hole freighter, you want it to get to its destination somewhere between 10 days and 40 days later. You want it to get there in pristine condition. So we are a big part of making sure that when that hatch gets opened at a foreign destination, that grain gets there in perfect condition.
So, yeah, I definitely agree. It's extremely important that we protect that commodity and keep it as perfect as we can. The last thing that we want is when it arrives to the destination for it to have any kind of insect activity or pest activity in it. So when you are starting the fumigation process, what are those first steps that you take?
So when you take a look at a vessel and what you need to do for it, you can, and by the way, on vessel fumigation, not only do we do grain fumigation, but we also do things like wood chips going to China or logs traveling to China, logs to India. So there's other commodities that you can put in a vessel, but the vast majority of what we do is grain. So you're looking at a vessel, the number one priority when you're looking at a vessel for fumigation is you have got to keep that crew safe for the entire voyage. So you've got a vessel that's going to travel, let's say it's going to travel from the Pacific Northwest to China, and that's an 18-day voyage. And this vessel will be at some point, well over 1,000 miles out to sea and away from any kind of land. So that crew of, say, 22 vessel employees has got to be kept safe. It's got to be so that when those people are performing their tasks and performing their duties, they're going to get home safely from being aboard that vessel. So the number one priority is protecting the worker aboard the vessel and the worker actually applying the fumigant. So we're going to take a look at the vessel to see that it's suitable to be fumigated, meaning it's not an old rust bucket and it's full of holes.
Right.
If the fumigant was to leak out of the hold nearest where, for example, where the crew accommodations are, that fumigant could leak into the superstructure and hurt, if not kill a crew member. We can't have that happening. So we're inspecting the vessel to be sure that there are no cracks or gaps. One of the main ones has been where they'll run piping or electrical lines and such through the hatch wall into the main superstructure of the vessel. And those are a position where gas can travel from the grain into where the crew is. One of the greatest advances in vessels that's happened over the last several years is all of the crew areas, accommodation, staterooms, offices, mess, kitchens, is all above or at main deck or above. It used to be that a lot of those crew areas were slightly below deck, and that's when crew members used to get hurt from fumigation. But the only thing below deck now is storage areas and an engine room with massive ventilation. So the vessels are much more inherently safer than they were even 20 years ago.
That's good.
Yeah, it helps facilitate what we do. So as you take a look at the vessel, and not only when we're looking at the vessel for suitability and checking for things like the rubber gaskets around the hatches where the hatch would seal to the vessel itself, and then any air circulation systems and such that are incorporated into the vessel to help aerate and keep the grain fresh as it travels. We have to be sure that we've identified these areas in the vessel where the gas could potentially come out. Now, phosphine gas, that's the most common gas we use in vessel fumigations. Phosphine gas has essentially a molecular weight that is really similar to the ambient outside air. So it really can just kind of come right out through the top, through any gaps or any holes in the hatches. You have to be super conscious to make sure that anything is sealed up. If they're out there sealing up the holds with extra tape or extra spray glue because they're concerned that rainwater will leak through the hatch, they know that there's a history with their vessel leaking. Well, if rainwater can leak in, gas can certainly leak out. So we're really checking that boat. Now, if it is just no way that this vessel can be sealed up enough to be fumigated or sealed up enough to keep the crew safe while the vessel's traveling, we simply advise the customer to not go to a destination that requires fumigation.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So you talked about some of the safety considerations, which obviously are extremely important. What's some of the safety equipment that is necessary for the fumigators to use during the application process? And then also, what's some of the safety equipment that the crew should have on hand during that voyage?
So when we do a fumigation, part of what we're doing with the vessel is we're having a pre-departure safety meeting with at least two people from the crew of the vessel who can understand English. And I say that only because so often the vessel crew personnel, they're not English speaking or English as a native language folks. So you work with the vessel's chief officer and captain. They determine two people on the crew that you actually have a safety meeting with, and you show them, we issue them and show them how to use a full face mask with a phosphine canister. And we issue them two masks and two canisters and show them how to put them on, and then encourage them, if they have others, just to be sure that they're using them correctly. And we show them and issue them 3 boxes of what are called colorimetric tubes, from more of a generic term, but basically that's a tube that hooks up to a small handheld pump that will pull an air sample through a matrix of gas detection product, and it will tell us or tell the crew what the concentration of a given space is. So during the voyage, the crew needs to go through and sample in the stateroom areas or in the ship's office or any of the enclosed area of the vessel where the crew is working or sleeping or relaxing, they'll go through and do a gas detection with these tubes and pumps. So we issue them at least 3 boxes, and it can be as many boxes as they would like to have, which is then 30 tubes. And at least a couple of times a day, they should go through with one of those tubes. And basically, you squeeze the little bulb pump on it, and it will pull a sample through and determine whether there's any gas at all. And the tubes are specific to phosphine. And you, of course, you're looking for a 0.3 part per million or less. And the crew is also taught that if it was more than 0.3 part per million, to open up the doors, portals, or whatever it is that helps the ventilation be encouraged, and continue to check those areas to be sure that the gas comes down. That's a precautionary step to be sure that there's no gas in any of those areas where they are. And one of the magical things that a lead fumigator really needs to do is help a vessel crew they can get very complacent and comfortable with the fumigation and do it over and over and over, just like a trap that a fumigator could fall into. And you really need to encourage that crew to do a good gas check and not just be complacent and really check. It's a long way out to sea to get some help for somebody that gets exposed to phosphine gas. And it's something that we just really pound home with them. And we try to have it be in a very positive but a very direct method. Please do this.
So that's great to hear. I'm very happy to hear that there's a lot of discussion with the crew about the safety, because phosphine is one of those few fumigants that you can do in transit fumigations in very specific environments like rail cars and vessels. You can't do any public roadway fumigations with phosphine, but you can do in transit fumigation, like I said, over waterways and then over rail lines with phosphine. And so having the people that are transporting that fumigated product from one area to another area, having them understand what's going on and giving them the tools and supplies needed to make sure that they're safe. Wow, what an important thing to do.
And it's one of those really interesting moments where you want people to be comfortable with what you're doing. You want them to understand that it can be a very safe task. It can be a very safe enterprise. You just don't want them to take it for granted or to get too comfortable with it, or to have the fumigator delivering that message get too comfortable and complacent with it, because it is very, very important. So we're issuing them 2 masks, 2 canisters, the tubes, the pump. And then there are occasions where vessels will specifically request an electronic gas monitor, which is great. No problem. We can help them out with that. And then one of the other interesting things is we start to study how we fumigate in the United States at the exit ports for the grain. Some of the comparisons, like I'm working closely with our Canadian folks as well, where there's some very interesting things that they do. There's this contrast with U.S. fumigations, where that's the safety equipment that's issued. But then in Canada, they're issuing 4 SCBA systems to the vessel as well as the masks. And so individual countries' regulations are what dictate what safety equipment is required to be issued. But the fumigator's common sense as well. If it needs to be something more than is being issued, they should err on the side of caution.
Oh, sure.
And then as far as what does the applicator wear, that was part of what your question was the applicator doing the work. One of the really fortunate things for us when we're using aluminum phosphide in comparison to products like magnesium, the aluminum is going to react much slower. And so when you open that flask and begin applying the product, it could be as much as 24 hours, or, Ben, as you're well aware, it could also be incredibly impacted by the amount of moisture in the air and the outside temperature. So when we are actually applying the fumigant, we're not in an exposure situation. We're putting a solid fumigant into a grain mass, and we can smell the warning agents only because the warning agents are very aggressive, but we're not exposed to a level of part per million that doesn't even approach threshold limits, and it's well below the 0.3 part per million that you can be in for an 8-hour exposure. If I have an employee who is particularly concerned about what potential exposures there are, I will issue them an electronic gas monitor during the actual fumigation to help them see that it is dramatically safer.
Sure.
One of the differences, though, is that when we get into a situation like with a wood chip vessel, where the applied amount of fumigant can be double or even triple what a grain vessel has applied, because the concentration is a lot bigger and because you're in the commodity perhaps as much as 4 times as long as you are with grain, we will issue masks and canisters to those crew just because they're in with a lot more fumigant for a lot more time.
So staying on that safety aspect, what are some of the safety considerations when you're fumigating a vessel? I mean, I would imagine that, if you're on the water, you're sometimes dealing with, slippery conditions or wet conditions on ship decks, a lot of stair climbing, a lot of height. I know the ship holds can be pretty deep. So what are some of the safety considerations that you as a fumigator have to take into account when you're prepping or fumigating the vessel?
So, and you're absolutely right. The greatest actual risk we have as applicators, or the greatest risk our crew people have, is actually slip trip kind of hazards. For example, if it's very, very dry and you're fumigating a soybean vessel, the soybeans are like marbles under your feet,
Right.
and you can slip and fall. The soybeans, when they're wet, are incredibly slippery. So you're either in an incredibly slippery, slimy situation or on marbles. Either of them is a real challenge. You almost learn to do a sort of a shuffle step as you move about the deck of the vessel. There are welded hatches on the deck of the ship that stick up perhaps 2 or 3 inches, or bolts or different welded things. And often we're on a vessel in the middle of the night in adverse weather conditions, with a hard hat on, and you've got your collar tip turned up, and you're trying to stay warm in the middle of a nasty weather, and you can trip over a hatch or trip over a laid out cord. The greatest risk we actually have to train for as fumigators and as crew lead folks is, what do you do about someone who has slipped and fell, or what do you do about someone who how can you help someone to stay upright? And that's not just thinking about us as crew people, because when we're out on a vessel doing the fumigation, we've also got a representative from FGIS Grain, one of the government officials actually witnessing the fumigation. You've got to be very conscious of their safety as well, because they're often working alone, if you will, from a perspective. They don't have a coworker. They've got us to keep an eye on them. And you've got foreign nationals who don't want to necessarily speak too much because they're not particularly happy about their English or something. So they're not necessarily sharing a risk with you. And so what we really have to be conscious of is slip trip. What would you do in the case of an emergency? So we have actually practiced many times. Okay, pretend your coworker here has fallen to the deck. What do we do from a safety perspective for that person now? Let's do some safety drills. What do we do to get that person out safely? And really, in the end, it's not a phosphine issue. It's not a fumigant exposure issue. It's that deck of a ship can be a treacherous place.
I imagine so. I mean, I have done some limited ship fumigations, very, very limited. I've done enough to understand the risk involved with it. Seeing, like you said, the bolts that stick out, the slippery conditions, you're on water, it can be very wet. You're working at height oftentimes. So I know that height is also a consideration. So yeah, I mean, I would imagine that safety has to be paramount.
Well, and very often you're doing this work extremely tired, like I say, because the vessel doesn't respect time of day.
Right.
When they load, want to leave, they load and want to leave. So it could be 2 a.m. on a Sunday in the middle of a driving snowstorm. They want to get going, get out there and do the work. And if we take the view that everybody on that vessel is our teammate, I also take the perspective, I treat that like they're my kids. And I want everybody on that vessel to exit their work incredibly safe.
That's a great way to look at it.
It's how we're all going to get to a position where we all come home safe. And we all, between the PPE required and reflective vests and hard hats and any of the things that we sort of take for granted, but we really in the end have to refocus on a regular basis, is how to identify a risk and prevent injury from that risk.
Right. I love the idea that you mentioned about practicing emergency situations and having discussions about how you would react to these different emergency situations. I think it's really important to think about things like that and to practice them in preparation, because the last thing that you want to do is run into a situation, an emergency situation where, say, somebody has to be rescued and you don't know what to do. You haven't practiced it. And sometimes minutes can mean the difference between life and death. And if you're unpracticed, it's going to take you longer to respond to an emergency situation. So having that practice, having those discussions seems to me like it's literally could be a matter of life and death.
Well, and it's really interesting. One of the things I really try to do with the folks I work with, even a veteran who's been around the business or someone who is a supervisor of mine, I try to take a look at this from their perspective and give them the tools they need to survive the moment. So one of the things that makes a new person's eyes light up, or someone who wants to move to the next level of supervision, is you take them aside and say, okay, let's do a drill where you are going to absolutely own an emergency situation and all of the communication that goes with it, so that when or if that situation ever came up, you just own it like crazy. And that's the kind of thing that makes their eyes light up. That's the kind of thing that makes it so that they have more satisfaction from their work. They're a lot more comfortable and confident in what they do, and they take it as a moment to grow in their own leadership. So when you're doing these things and you're teaching folks or you're coaching folks on how to be safe and stay safe on the deck of a ship, is just one more of the ways that we can help those who are trying to cultivate and grow to be that much more. And then one of the other things I love about it is when we approach the control room at a dock and say, hey, we want to do a drill, or when we approach someone at a grain facility and say, hey, let's do this together. Let's have a drill together on perhaps an employee who will pretend they fell and broke something or whatever the case may be. They love those moments too, where they're like, hey, we could use a brush up on how we approach this as well. And we really appreciate that safety perspective. With so many of our sites and our customers, safety is number one. Nothing comes higher. And when we show those we work with that is our priority as well, well, truthfully, your stock rises with these people. So if you want a site you're working with, and it could be a grain facility in the middle of the country, that's one of the really good ways to do it, is where you're showing them how seriously you take safety as well. And it gives everybody a chance to rise.
What an excellent point. I really love that. That really shows true partnership between the fumigator and the people responsible for the fumigated vessel, grain bin, commodity, facility, whatever the case is. It really does show that true partnership. One thing I did want to ask you too, before we get too far into this, was I know that there are some destination country specifics on fumigants and fumigant use, but I wanted to just kind of dive in a little bit on how the fumigants are selected. Do the fumigators sometimes have options to choose which fumigant to use for vessel fumigations, or is that all dictated by the destination country's specific requests?
The country receiving, or quite often the customer in the country receiving, can specify a fumigant dosage and request whether that is applied directly to the grain, or if it's applied in a dust retention sleeve so that the dust can be removed before discharge of the commodity. And each country is a little bit different. And then sometimes even within a country, there'll be a regulation, say at 33 gram per 1,000 cubic feet of application. But a customer will specifically say, no, I really want this applied at 45 gram per 1,000. And as long as their request is above the minimum for that country and below the maximum for a label rate, we will accommodate whatever they need. And I mentioned direct and dust retain. For example, China will specify that anything they receive, the fumigant, the solid fumigant, goes inside of a dust retention sleeve. And then when they open up the hatches and do aeration at destination in China, one of the crew people will simply pull that sleeve out, and that can be disposed of so that the inert clay powders and such that are part of the fumigant can simply be disposed of. And it's been a real challenge for me to try to understand why some countries will require dust retention and some not. I always used to think it was a food grade versus animal grade for what the commodity is doing. But I think it also really gets into what kind of cleaning facilities they have on the receiving end for dust removal and such.
Okay, that makes perfect sense to me. You mentioned retention sleeves. I know that those are used pretty commonly, especially for Chinese exports or exports to China. What's some of the other equipment? I know we use the recirculation system in a lot of grain bins, especially when we're fumigating with phosphine. That's cycling the fumigant down through the grain mass. And to the best of my knowledge, at least every ship fumigation or vessel fumigation I've been involved in, they've also used recirculation during the fumigant exposure period. Is that the case? And if so, what's some of the equipment that is needed for that?
The U.S. regulation gets into 20 meters of depth. So if a hold is 20 meters or deeper, you need to use a recirculation system. So basically what the recirculation system is doing is it's sucking air and fumigant that is volatilizing from the top of the grain mass and then blows it into the bottom of the grain mass through a system of what equals out to be about 320 to 350 linear feet of various kinds of tubing. One of the interesting things about phosphine gas and a lot of fumigants out there on the market with the average commodity of wheat or soybeans or whatever, if you didn't do any recirculation at all, fumigant is really going to go about 10 feet a day. So if your hold is, say, 60 feet deep, it's going to take 6 days for that fumigant to penetrate to the bottom of the hold. And then if you've got a further minimum of 4 days, for example, based on temperature and such, that the fumigant has to be within the commodity to achieve the wanted kill, you're talking about 10 days of fumigation time before you've killed the target pest. What the recirculation does by sucking it off of the top and blowing it into the bottom, it takes that 6 days for fumigant spread down to 1. It's forcing the air through the grain. So that's a critical piece of equipment, either on a fumigation that is of a too short of a time frame, say grain traveling from the Gulf into Mexico, or one of the ones we do quite a bit is wheat traveling from the Pacific Northwest down into Central and South America. We'll do fumigation on vessels into places like Guatemala and El Salvador, where you're getting perhaps about a 7-day exposure. Well, if it took 6 days just for the fumigant to penetrate to the bottom of the hold, you're not going to get a good kill. The recirculation fixes that.
So I know, especially when you're dealing with destination countries with different regulatory requirements, I would imagine the paperwork for these fumigations can get a little tricky. So I did want to ask you, what are some of the paperwork requirements for the fumigator that we have to worry about when fumigating vessels for export?
And one of the interesting things is that there is a script of sorts. There's a one-page document that USDA FGIS, Federal Grain Inspection Service, requires we say certain things and we write certain things. And there will actually, every time you do a fumigation for export grain where there is a phytosanitary certificate being written, there will be a government officer watching you do your safety meeting and watching you do the conversation with the vessel and then actually watching the fume. And so they actually will have something where there is, did you mention the amount of gas that can be in a space where you're working? Did you have it written down for the voyage time? What is the temperature? What is the time of day? There are several things that need to be in that record. Interestingly, most of them are the same information that you would have if you were fumigating a grain bin in Cairo, Illinois. It's the same conversation about temperature, time of day, what your application rate is. The only things that start to get added are what's your destination, what special things that are going on with that vessel, like if the holds need to get a physical seal when you're done, which is just basically a tool that the importing country will go aboard the vessel and look to see if any of the holds have been opened or tampered with. So the paperwork, it's interesting in one of those moments. There can actually be a little less paperwork sometimes than a big, massive facility fumigation because it is so streamlined. Our paperwork is incredible. We've got a 3-page document we do at the fumigation itself, which basically specifically lists how big, what's the cubic capacity of each hold, what is the condition of those holds, are they suitable for fumigation? What's your application rate per 1,000 cubic feet? Did you use a recirculation system or not? Did you do dust retained or not? How many flasks of fumigant or how many pellets or how many tablets did you put into each hold? So there'll be a specific page that lists what each of the 5 or 7 holds capacity is. And we're not concerned at all about how loaded that hold is at fumigation. We treat that hold as an empty space for dosing our fumigant. So a hold could have 15,000 tons of product in it, or it could have 5 tons. Either way, we treat it the same. And so what you're basically listing out is when you did it, the temperature you did it, where you did it, what the name of the vessel is, and then exactly how much fumigant you put into each hold based on the information you had. Now, of course, the vessel is going to know how large their holds are and everything. But if I specifically list it on my paperwork, that shows where I got my mathematic calculations from. That paperwork also testifies, if you will, that we did issue the 2 masks, 2 canisters, 3 boxes of tubes, 1 pump, and any other safety equipment issued to the vessel. It is a central point where everything about that fumigation was documented. It also documents the names of the 2 crew people who were specifically instructed with listening to our safety talk so that if there was ever any issues, they could say, well, who on the crew did you discuss this with? And we can use their names and say, here's who we dealt with. And when you actually do all of this work, the way we prove to everyone that this, in fact, was what we did for that boat, we get what's called a ship stamp. Every vessel that travels has a little rubber stamp that is only on that vessel, and they stamp our paperwork showing that our paperwork was physically present on that boat, and it ties it up real nice. It essentially is the same as any other fumigation you'll do. You just consider a little more specific in detail and a little bit more towards what safety equipment, because the interesting thing about that is, we apply a lot of fumigant, but we aerate very little. When you look at it from a perspective of years and years of being, I've fumigated a lot of major structures. The aeration of that structure is critical in what you did and how you cleared it for the people to come back to work and continue to make their cookies or whatever the case may be. But when you've fumigated these vessels, they sail away under gas. And you may see that vessel again in 6 weeks or in 2 years or 10 years. But really, for all the fumigant we apply, we aerate very little of it. That's done at the receiving port. So we've got to be very careful that those folks who are doing the aeration are for the crews on board, that they know exactly what they're aerating and how much there was applied.
Sounds critical. It sounds very similar or almost like a modified fumigation management plan specifically designed for vessel fumigation.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It is a very good fumigation management plan. It is a plan that really shows everything. It really is, in the end, it's a combined, while we're still doing an FMP, a fumigation management plan for a vessel that's separate because of regulatory concerns, it really is one document in the end that does everything. And it can travel with the vessel so that if there's any questions at any point. And another part of that I might mention is when we do that paperwork, we're also issuing them about 8 pages of printed documentation that says things like first aid and care requirements in case someone is exposed to phosphine. There's instructions that discuss our motors for recirculation, how the tubing is installed. and then disposal of fumigate instruction for the receiving port. So when this gets to China, or if it's a port specifically where there was dust retained sleeves, there's a separate piece of paper that they can give to those who are disposing of the fumigant that shows them how to handle it safely.
That's terrific. I only have one more question for you, Michael, and I ask this of every podcast guest in some capacity or another.
Oh boy, I'm ready. What do you got?
What advice would you give a new fumigator, somebody that's just getting into the industry, has very little knowledge? What advice would you give that person about fumigating vessels effectively?
Always be ready to learn. Accept the fact that no matter how much you know or how old you get or how young you are, that you have something to learn. Listen to the person who's out there. You might do 1,000 fumigations, and then on number 1,001, you have somebody walk by and give a sort of an off the cuff remark about something, and you listen to it and you go, "Oh my God, that's an incredible idea." Do that. Listen to those around you. Listen to the new guy walking on who says, "Why don't you do this?" And if you've got a good explanation for why you don't, then don't execute that. You can say, "No, this is why we don't." But listen to those around you and be willing to learn. I had been doing fumigations, as an example, I had been doing fumigation on structures and on residences and buildings for I think I was 25 years into my time doing fumigations. And I was watching YouTube videos on house fumigations. And I've spent a lot of my time stapling or trying to tape burlap or something onto a vent to keep it from coming off. And it was really irritating. And I watched this man with an armload of bathroom rugs, the kind that is a rug on one side and rubber backing on the other. And this guy simply walked around the roof and dropped those rugs onto the vent. And they stayed while they were being tarped. They would stay there because of the rubber backing. And it was one of those moments, it's like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? And you're going to be out on a job. You're going to be in the middle of fumigating a large tobacco warehouse or a cookie factory or a rice facility, or you're in Arkansas trying to get a big rice thing done. And somebody's going to give you a little thing. You're going to be on this job for 3 days, and someone's going to mention something to you in 5 minutes that just changes your world in fumigation. Let those moments happen. Be willing to learn and accept and soak up the new bits of information. Have an open mind. That is why this job to me is so fascinating, because no matter how long I'm doing it, I still learn. Today already, I have learned a couple of things, and I learn every day. Treat it that way. And if you're not learning, take a different perspective. There's something going on that you need to change.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that as some advice, and speaking of that, I have learned so much today during this podcast. As I stated before, I don't have a lot of experience with ship fumigation. So speaking with experts like yourself and asking you questions about some of the safety, specifically the safety involved with ship fumigations, some of the paperwork, all of the things that we discussed today. What a learning experience for me. I know that it doesn't replace actually getting onto a ship and actually conducting fumigations or taking part in them, but it sure is a really solid step forward in the learning process. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the chance. Love it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. I want to thank Michael for talking to us about ship fumigations. This is a fumigation type that I myself am not too familiar with, so having an expert join me to discuss was certainly eye-opening for sure. And that's it for Season 4 of Degesch America Presents. We sure hope you found the information that we discussed valuable. I know I had a great time talking shop with all of our wonderful guests. I'm so happy that we have so many wonderful, talented people in our industry to rely on for further training and education. And remember, if you have a question you'd like for us to answer, please feel free to email us at podcast@degeschamerica.com. And you can also find us on our website at degeschamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. And so, until next season, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.